Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. The Battle of Bedstraw Common. In the 130th year of the Common Reckoning, Osfrid the Skelding led an army against the halflings of Elm Grove. Osfrid's objective was straightforward. He wanted to clear the land of halflings so he could take it for himself and his followers. If the halflings chose to remove themselves elsewhere, leaving their crops and livestock behind them, then he was happy to let them go in peace. He was not in favour of unnecessary bloodshed. But if the halflings chose otherwise, well, bloodshed would be necessary, and he would kill them all. His plan was simple. He would march on Elm Grove and establish his base there. The halfling dwellings might be somewhat on the small side, but they would provide his men with more shelter than the open countryside. From Elm Grove he could send out bands of troops to sweep the surrounding territory free of halflings. Having taken control of the whole area, he would divide it between his liegemen, reserving the town and its immediate environs for his own estate. The halflings were not expecting a Skelding incursion, but they were not entirely unprepared for war. The previous year a raiding band of Amazons had ravaged the halfling lands. The mayor of Elm Grove, a chubby little halfling chap, aren't they all, by the name of Pando Eartuft, had made arrangements to raise a levy of halflings to defend the town should the Amazons return. As news of the advancing Skeldings reached him, he put those arrangements into effect. He was only just in time. The Skeldings marched quickly, but as they reached the outskirts of Elm Grove, the halflings were waiting for them. Immediately to the west of Elm Grove was Bedstraw Common, a flat expanse of meadow where the townsfolk grazed their cattle. On the far side of the meadow was a band of woodland, which screened the gurgling stream beyond from nervous halfling eyes. Halflings do not like open water, and they did not willingly approach what they saw as a treacherous torrent. With much anxiety they had constructed a single bridge, which could be used when it was absolutely necessary for a halfling to cross the watercourse in question. Making such a dangerous journey was regarded with great trepidation, although the water was barely deep enough to cover a halfling's knees and could easily have been forded. Pando had raised a force of some 350 halflings. These were armed with a miscellany of improvised weapons, hunting bows and slings, crude spears and homemade shields. He arrayed the majority of these troops on the outskirts of the town, behind the walls separating the backyards of individual halfling houses from the common land beyond, placing them under the immediate command of his brother, Odo, who set up his banner in front of an orchard overlooking the common. Pando himself took the remaining 100 halflings, who were armed with slings, and divided them into two groups, which he ordered to push forward onto the common and harass the approaching Skelding forces, before falling back upon the main body of the halflings. He led the right hand of these columns in person. As the halflings hurriedly made these dispositions, Osfrid's forces had reached the bridge. At the front of the army marched the light infantry, some 70 or so men armed with swords and javelins and carrying shields. Behind them marched a similar number of spearmen, also with shields, many of whom wore armour. Osfrid ordered these two groups to cross the bridge. He waited on the bank with his horsemen, holding them in reserve. The final component of Osfrid's army was his archers. He had some 80 of these, which he divided into two groups, placing one on each flank. They were ordered to ford the stream and push through the woods, where they could provide ranged support to the main body of infantry in the centre. Thus the stage was set for for the struggle which was later known as the Battle of Bedstraw Common. Under Osfrid's watchful eye, his serried infantry marched over the bridge. On his right, the archers waded across the stream, but the archers on his left proved less willing to get their feet wet, hesitating on the river bank. Having crossed the bridge, Osfrid's light infantry could now see the two groups of halfling slingers positioned on the common. The javelin men surged forward toward the group on their right, while the archers on that flank advanced through the trees in support. The halfling slingers steadied themselves and let their slingstones fly. Unfortunately for the halflings, the resulting casualties only served to provoke the Skeldings, who launched a cloud of javelins in return before immediately charging into the halflings and slaughtering them where they stood. Osfrid observed the killing with grim satisfaction. He and his cavalry waded the stream, hoping to exploit the success of the light infantry. After much cajoling and shouting, the archers on Osfrid's left had been urged into the water and now emerged on the far bank. They pushed through the trees before them to the edge of the meadow. Out on the common they beheld Pando Eartuft and his group of slingers. The halflings were distracted by the Skelding spearmen advancing toward them, and did not notice the archers in the trees. The volley of arrows that killed half of them therefore came as a complete surprise. Having previously observed the fate of the slingers on the other side of the field, Pando decided that discretion was the better part of valour, and ordered the survivors to fall back. Meanwhile, the Skelding light infantry regrouped, and the spearmen pushed up alongside them, and then the entire Skelding army advanced across Bedstraw Common. Facing them, at the edge of the town, the halflings braced themselves to receive the Skelding onslaught. Pando and his remaining slingers joined them. Nervous halfling fingers knocked arrows, and white knuckles gripped halfling spears. Once again, it was the light infantry who led the Skelding advance. Initially they pushed forward on the Skelding right, but noticing that the halflings facing them on that flank were rather numerous, they swerved to the left, intending to charge the halflings in the centre by the orchard, grouped around Odo's banner. But they paid a heavy price for this manoeuvre, which exposed them to archery from both the halfling left and centre. And now the spearmen following behind the light infantry came within range of halfling missiles, and they too began to suffer casualties. But they pushed on, moving up alongside the light infantry, preparing to assault Odo's position. Odo called the halflings on his right flank to his assistance, and they hurried toward him. Osfrid and his cavalry had continued to advance on the Skelding right, following behind the Skelding light infantry. When the latter shifted the axis of their attack to the centre, this exposed the mass ranks of the halfling left to Osfrid's gaze. But while this sight had encouraged his light infantry to turn aside, it inspired Osfrid to charge. The Skelding cavalry thundered forward. Halfling bowstrings twanged, and some of the horses and horsemen tumbled to the ground. Some of the other horses turned and fled, bearing their riders with them. But the majority of the horsemen charged home. The halfling ranks were trampled, slain, and scattered. But the halflings proved resilient and reformed their line, holding the horsemen at bay. In the centre, the Skelding infantry were still being tormented by halfling archery. And that was not all. Halfling spearmen charged from the orchard into the Skelding spearmen, and a fierce hand-to-hand combat ensued. The Skelding light infantry returned the compliment. Behind a barrage of flying javelins, they charged the halflings who remained in the orchard. And now the melee became general, as Pando's remaining slingers and the halflings coming up from his right joined in. As the confused mass of Skelding and Halfling infantry exchanged blows, the archers on the Skelding left moved up to within bowshot, and Skelding arrows began to find their mark. The archers on the Skelding right had also continued their advance. As they came within bowshot of the struggle between the Halflings and the Skelding cavalry, the horsemen started to fall back, and the Halflings took this opportunity to also take a step back and regather themselves. In the centre, the fighting also paused. The Halflings who had charged the Skelding spearmen had all been slain or fallen back. The Skelding ranks were in disarray. Both sides regrouped and caught their breath. And then the battle recommenced. The reformed ranks of the Skelding spearmen charged into their Halfling counterparts. Halfling and Skelding archers exchanged arrows, and in the orchard the remaining Skelding light infantry, now much reduced in number, charged Odo, who had now been joined by his brother. That was a particularly vicious fight, and in it Pando was slain. On the Skelding right, Osfrid ordered his archers to loose a volley of arrows at the Halflings, who continued to confront him, and behind this deadly arrow storm the Skelding cavalry, with Osfrid at their head, once more charged their tiny foes. But even as Osfrid laughed with the joy of battle and slaughter, a Halfling spear thrust upward under the skirt of his mail and pierced his vitals. Transfixed, Osfrid fell from his horse and breathed his last in the blood-soaked dust, and thus Pando was avenged. But this was small consolation to the Halflings. Osfrid might be dead, but the Halfling left had finally been shattered. The archers finished off the survivors. In the orchard, Odo gathered the remaining Halflings to him, rallying them for one last effort. But in vain. The Skelding spearmen charged, and that was the end. As evening fell, Odo led a small band of 20 or so Halflings through Elmgrove and along the road toward Muffins. This was all that remained of his brother's levy army. Behind them, the rampaging and victorious Skeldings started to sack the now defenceless town. Thus ended the Battle of Bedstraw Common.